One of the main points on which I focused essentially for the last 8 years has been the obvious realignment taking place ever since it became apparent that Donald Trump and his very unorthodox policy views for a Republican candidate would actually prevail and would begin to reshape the political landscape. There was obviously a large part of that which was about economic populism in a way that the Democratic Party had abandoned and never gotten near since at least 3 or 4 decades ago with the emergence of Bill Clinton and his linking of the Democratic Party to a strictly corporatist agenda and donor base. But it was even more true when it came to foreign policy, where Trump's campaign in 2016 was based on a very vocal and emphatic repudiation of the foreign policy of George Bush and Dick Cheney and Barack Obama and neoconservatism and the idea that the United States should go around the world fighting all sorts of pointless wars. And although there were things the Trump administration did, like sending arms to Ukraine, lethal arms to Ukraine, and other things that one can definitely argue with, nonetheless, it is just the case. It is just a historical fact that Donald Trump was the first president in decades not to involve the U.S. in a new war, unlike, say, the Biden administration's involvement of the U.S. in the war in Ukraine and Russia, our involvement in the war by Israel in Gaza, the broader Middle East wars where we deployed military assets and bombed the Houthis in Yemen and various sectors of Iraq. There was no new war that the Trump administration and Donald Trump got the U.S. involved into. Meanwhile, Kamala Harris's campaign continues to rely on the endorsements and the support of basically the worst warmongers that the United States knows and has seen over the last several decades. Obviously, we spent a lot of time covering the fact that she has repeatedly touted, as though it's something to be proud of, the fact that Liz Cheney and Dick Cheney have endorsed her, and not just touted the endorsement, but heaped praise on them for doing so. He praised on Dick Cheney as a great patriot, someone who has served his country with such honor and distinction, Dick Cheney. She has a new ad, Kamala Harris does, for this closing part of the campaign. It was produced last month. It's now up in multiple swing states, and the people who she's touting and whose words she's elevating as someone that you should listen to are, on some level, even worse than Dick and Liz Cheney. Here they are.
In 2016, Donald Trump said he would choose only the best people to work in his White House. Now those people have a warning for America. Trump is not fit to be president again. Here's his vice president.
Anyone who puts himself over the Constitution should never be president of the United States. It should come as no surprise that I will not be endorsing Donald Trump this year.
His defense secretary.
Do you think Trump can be trusted with the nation's secrets ever again?
No. I mean, it's just irresponsible action that places our service members at risk, places our nation's security at risk.
His national security advisor.
Donald Trump will cause a lot of damage. The only thing he cares about is Donald Trump.
And the nation's highest ranking military officer.
We don't take an oath to a king or a queen or to a tyrant or a dictator. And we don't take an oath to a wannabe dictator.
Take it from the people who knew him best. Donald Trump is a danger to our troops and our democracy. We can't let him lead our country again.
I'm Kamala Harris, and I approve this message.
So there you have it. These are people who, in the case of John Bolton, and Mike Pence for that matter, are fanatical warmongers, have supported basically every U.S. war of the past 20 years, but have proposed and advocated for many others. In fact, Bolton left when Trump wouldn't take more aggressive action against Iran, wouldn't pursue the coup that he wanted to engineer in Venezuela. When he essentially, Trump did, was resisting all sorts of further aggression that Bolton has long advocated throughout the world. And this is who Kamala Harris is now presenting as some wise statesman whose voice should be heard and listened to as some kind of guru of national security, where if he dislikes Trump, that means, given how wise and noble John Bolton is, it means that you too should not trust Trump. And then you have people like Mark Espers, who was Donald Trump's defense secretary, who, although Trump did appoint him, is straight from the military-industrial swamp, somebody who has been in and out of the revolving doors in military corporations and then the Defense Department. And of course, he too hates Trump for not pursuing the standard foreign policy that has governed the United States for decades. And then other orthodoxies that Trump challenges, like membership in NATO, that are central to the entire war-making machine of the United States. Of course, these people not only don't want Trump, but hope that Kamala Harris wins. And the fact that Kamala Harris continues to put these people front and center. John Bolton, who was so anathema to Democratic Party politics that during the Bush administration, when Bush could get everything he wanted because it was in the wake of 9/11, John Bolton was the only bridge too far for congressional Democrats and even for some Republicans. When Bush tried to nominate him for a position that required congressional approval and Senate confirmation, the Senate rejected his nomination, John Bolton's, because he was just such a madman, such a fanatic. This is who now forms one of the centerpieces of Kamala Harris's argument that she is better than Donald Trump. Now, here, speaking of sociopathic neocons and warmongers, the Jewish Insider yesterday had an article entitled, quote, "Never Trump Republicans Make a Conservative Jewish Case for Kamala Harris." And the people they're referring to are Bill Kristol, who I guess I should have put in, along with Lindsey Graham and John McCain, is one of the only people who could compete with John Bolton when it comes to sociopathic warmongering, and Elliot Cohen, who worked in various positions in the Bush-Cheney administration, who is long time one of the core neocon architects of war in the Middle East to protect Israel. And here's Bill Kristol and Elliot Cohen arguing that, quote, despite some disagreements, Kamala Harris is pro-Israel and would be a more consistent and reliable hand in foreign policy than Donald Trump. Now, if anything should be disqualifying for a presidential candidate, it's for Bill Kristol to think that you are the best steward of foreign policy, both in the Middle East when it comes to Israel and beyond. Everything Bill Kristol has ever put his hands on has turned to garbage. We devoted an entire show to Bill Kristol and his history, how he was advocating for regime change wars in Iraq and Iran well before 9/11 throughout the 90s, and then immediately helped exploit 9/11 in order to get those wars that he had long wanted for reasons having nothing to do with American interests. He supported torture and rendition and Guantanamo and due process-free punishments, and was one of the people who wanted to go from Baghdad to Tehran and not just overthrow Saddam Hussein, but also the Iranian government, and to do so in Syria, to do so in Libya. And of course, he's now a fanatical supporter of the war in Ukraine. It's just, he wind Bill Kristol up, and his function in life is to urge America to go to war for whatever interests he cares most about. And here he is arguing that Kamala Harris is not just important to support because of Bill Kristol's deep love of democracy, but also because she would be best for Israel. She would be best for the Middle East and best for foreign policy in general, better than Trump. Quote, Bill Kristol acknowledged that Harris, quote, probably isn't quite as good as she could be on Israel, but argued that few administrations, including that of George Bush, have entirely been on the same page as Israel. So he's saying, look, we want her to just be a blind clone of whatever Israel wants, she does. And unfortunately, she doesn't obey Israel in every single instance obediently, but he says no president does, even George W. Bush. But he says, nonetheless, quote, Kamala Harris may not be entirely perfect, but for some people's point of view, but directionally it's just fundamentally different. And Kamala Harris is on the right side of this directional vector, and Trump is on the Buchanan side, Kristol said, referring to the hard-right isolationist GOP presidential candidate, Pat Buchanan, who you may recall ran a very successful primary campaign against the incumbent president, George Bush 41, by arguing that the United States was simply too interventionist and too aggressive and too militaristic around the world at the expense of the American people, benefiting a tiny elite, which then became Ron Paul's outlook, where he also did extremely well despite almost no institutional support in the Republican primary both times he ran, and then that carried over into 2016 when that became Donald Trump's view. So if you look at Bill Kristol and his history on the one hand, including his fanatical support for the invasion of Iraq, and then you look at, say, Pat Buchanan on the other, which is the person whom he's contrasting and comparing to Trump, Pat Buchanan was an outspoken and vocal opponent of the war in Iraq. If you go back and read Pat Buchanan's 2002 and 2003 articles, whatever you want to say about Pat Buchanan, few people are as historically knowledgeable and as good of a writer as he is. And he was one of the very few people, not wishy-washy in his opposition to the war in Iraq, saying, oh, maybe we should wait to see the inspectors do their job, or let's see if there's weapons of mass destruction. He knew exactly and predicted exactly that the United States would end up getting caught up in an endless war, and totally incapable of controlling that country, having a huge civil war, uniting the Shia and the Sunnis against the United States, which we were told was impossible, and basically predicting everything that would happen. While all these people that Kamala Harris is building her campaign around, obviously beginning with Dick Cheney and going to Bill Kristol and everybody else, were the people cheering not only for that, along with much of the Democratic Party, including Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden, John Kerry, but who now want constant interventions in other parts of the world. That just is the foreign policy of the Democratic Party, which is why I often say, if I were Bill Kristol, if I were Dick Cheney, I also would support the Kamala Harris campaign. Because as Liz Cheney has often argued continuously, the Democratic Party and Kamala Harris are much closer to the neocons and to the Cheney's foreign policy view than a Trump-led GOP is. Now, Donald Trump himself spoke last week at the Detroit Economic Club, and he shared some of his views on foreign policy, and you can understand why people like Dick Cheney and Bill Kristol are so concerned about how he sees the role of the U.S. in the world. Here's part of what he said.
They didn't do that either. So we go in, we blow up countries, and then we leave. We got nothing except dead people all over the place on both sides. How stupid are we? That was a Cheney deal and a Bush. How stupid are we? Not just Democrats. It's both. I'm equally angry at both.
So that is his view of foreign policy that he's been expressing since 2016. And as I said, it wasn't just rhetoric. He followed through, not in all ways, but certainly in some important ways, including by being the first president in decades not to involve the U.S. in exactly those kinds of wars. While people like Bill Kristol and Dick Cheney and all the Lincoln Project people, former Republican neocons who are supporters of John McCain, and many in the Democratic Party, including Kamala Harris, support everyone, one after the next. Speaking of the Lincoln Project scumbags, the people like Rick Wilson and founded by Steve Schmidt, who have been pilfering the money from gullible liberals to build what they boasted of what they were achieving, which was, quote, intergenerational wealth. They have not only been opposed to Trump since 2016, but fanatically supportive of the Democratic Party. First Hillary Clinton, then Joe Biden, now Kamala Harris. And they have an ad, which these ads don't actually have an impact. They're put anywhere. They're just designed to stimulate the id of gullible resistance liberals into giving them more money. But it does often reflect the ethos of the pro-Kamala, pro-Democratic Party forces that have really taken center stage, people like those who founded the Lincoln Project. And here's what their ad shows.
Dick, we never got along.
Correct.
You were a warmonger.
And you were a commie.
Surprising to be on the same side as you.
Surprising to me, too.
I'm still on the left.
I'm still on the right.
But if we can agree on Trump...
It means something big.
Bigger than policy.
Bigger than ideology.
We are both voting for Kamala Harris.
Because this election is a choice between America...
or Trump.
Isn't that adorable? Bernie Sanders and Dick Cheney and Bill Kristol are all on the same side. And this is supposed to somehow be encouraging American voters to actually think that this confederation of establishment figures is somehow a good sign that if they vote for Kamala, things are going to actually change. This is the sort of thing that impresses Beltway media and Beltway politicians. Like, oh, wow, she's been able to get, like establishment Republicans on her side. That's going to be really good for swing voters in Pennsylvania. But what they continue to not understand is that most of this voting, most of the sentiments of these voters who aren't already Democrats is anti-establishment. They hate Washington. They hate the status quo. And they originally were open to Kamala because she was presenting herself and appearing to be a sort of candidate of change. And the Trump campaign has done a good job, as has the Kamala Harris campaign, of reminding everybody that she's actually been in power for the last 4 years. And when asked what she would do differently than Joe Biden, she was unable to identify a single thing. So much of this is the kind of thing that inside the Beltway DC strategists think is effective, that media figures swoon over. It reminds me a lot of one of the funniest incidents, which is when Donald Trump was running for president in 2016. It was actually in 2015. He was leading the polls, and every political journalist was saying, oh, this is never going to last. This is like when Michelle Bachmann had her lead, or Ben Carson, or all these other people, and then they always collapse. And in 2015, it was when John McCain started speaking very poorly of Trump. And so when Trump was asked about John McCain, that was when he gave his notorious/famous remark, which is, yeah, John McCain was in the military, but I prefer people who aren't caught, who don't end up as prisoners of war. He got caught. His plane crashed. And I remember media figures, including the dean of political journalism, Dan Baltz of the Washington Post, wrote articles saying, oh, this is the end of Trump. You're going to start to see his polling collapse. You can't speak ill of John McCain, this beloved figure. John McCain wasn't beloved by anybody except the DC press. He had run for president in 2008 and got killed by Barack Obama. But that's how they think. They think that everybody reveres this kind of confederation of establishment figures like they do. Now, back in 2020, there was this remarkable controversy surrounding the Bernie Sanders campaign. Essentially, Joe Rogan had come out and said that Bernie was his favorite candidate and he would likely vote for Bernie. And one of the things the Sanders campaign did was begin touting the support of Bernie Sanders by Joe Rogan, on the grounds that Joe Rogan is not a partisan Democrat, that he reaches a lot of people who aren't Democrats. And here was Joe Rogan saying, I think Bernie Sanders is the best candidate. And they put in their ads clips of Joe Rogan saying it. Bernie Sanders himself went onto Twitter to tout this, and this is what he wrote, quote, this is quoting Joe Rogan, quote, I think I'll probably vote for Bernie. He's been insanely consistent his entire life. He's basically been saying the same thing, been for the same thing his whole life, and that in and of itself is very, very powerful structure to operate from. Now, the very same people who are completely fine with Kamala Harris building her campaign around people like Dick Cheney and Bill Kristol and John Bolton, the worst and most destructive people on the planet, back in 2020 claimed they were so offended that Bernie Sanders would tout the endorsement of Joe Rogan that he should immediately have to rescind and reject that endorsement because Joe Rogan is so toxic, such a racist, such a hater of LGBT people, that Bernie Sanders should be nowhere near Joe Rogan when it comes to his campaign. And here's the BBC in January 2020, quote, Bernie Sanders faces ire over Joe Rogan endorsement. Quote, Joe Rogan, a comedian turned provocateur, has told his 7 million YouTube subscribers that he would, quote, probably vote for Bernie. Amid the ensuing outcry, Mr. Sanders said his campaign was, quote, a big tent. Mr. Rogan has previously drawn criticism for making what some consider sexist and transphobic comments. The decision to highlight the association with Mr. Rogan provoked criticism of some of Mr. Sanders' own backers. In particular, there has been heavy criticism from some transgender women who have labeled Mr. Rogan, quote, transphobic over previous comments he has made on his show. So apparently Joe Rogan is completely beyond the pale as someone whose support you can tout in the modern day Democratic Party because of his heresy on social issues. But people like Dick Cheney, John Bolton, and Bill Kristol are to be celebrated on the grounds that we need to get as many votes as possible. One of the people who was very upset by Joe Rogan being featured in a Bernie Sanders ad in his tweet was AOC. Here's National Review reporting in March of 2022. The title, quote, it was like pulling teeth. AOC backed away from Sanders' campaign after the Joe Rogan endorsement. Quote, Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez declined multiple pleas from the Bernie Sanders campaign to stump for the Vermont senator's candidacy after the Iowa caucuses. Ocasio-Cortez was heavily involved in the campaign's build-up to Iowa, headlining several rallies for Sanders in Iowa over the weekend of January 24th to 26th, but the progressive New York representative disagreed with the campaign over its decision to promote the endorsement of Joe Rogan, the popular podcaster who has been criticized by LGBT activists for opposing puberty blockers for gender-confused children. What a monster, what a hater. He questions the safety and efficacy of puberty blockers, an experimental medication for gender-confused children. He has also spoken out against the participation of biological males competing in women's sports. And that was enough to place Bernie Sanders beyond the pale for people like AOC and for so many people, not just on the liberal wing of the Democratic Party, but also the left wing of the Democratic Party. And here you see the real priorities of the Democratic Party. You can be a complete warmonger. You can be a sociopath wanting to give Israel every weapon and all the money in the world, as Kamala Harris wants to do, as Bill Kristol wants to do, as obviously Dick Cheney and John Bolton favor doing. You can be somebody who has spent your whole adult life advocating wars and bombing campaigns and invasions all around the world for completely destructive reasons. You can be wrong about everything on foreign policy, and not a single liberal, not AOC, not any of them, will utter a peep of objection about Kamala Harris heaping praise on Dick Cheney, heaping praise on John Bolton, featuring him in an ad, Bill Kristol. Because the Democratic Party doesn't have any foreign policy views. And to the extent they do, they absolutely align now with the Bush-Cheney conservatives and the neocons from that era. And that's why so many of them are not only integrated into Kamala Harris's campaign, but major players that are featured by it. And you don't hear a peep of protest from any of them, the way so many people attack Bernie Sanders for the crime of attaching himself to Joe Rogan simply by citing Joe Rogan's positive words, because Joe Rogan is beyond the pale because he questions puberty blockers for children and whether trans women can fairly participate in sports. That's what is the real heresy. But being a neocon, being Bill Kristol or Dick Cheney, and wanting to arm Israel and support what they're doing in Gaza, invade other countries, go to Iran, bomb Iran, do regime change all over the world, that's completely acceptable and even praiseworthy in the modern day Democratic Party. And so much of Kamala Harris's campaign, more than anything else I've ever said on this topic, illustrates exactly what that party is. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.